I'm Rod Henshaw, Dean of Coles Library. Please welcome again to Drake and another Live at Coles event. Our program this evening is entitled Bloodlines, the Civil War in Caricature, presented by Richard Samuel West. This lecture is in conjunction with the Anderson Gallery exhibit, Draw Your Weapons, Civil War Cartoons from Harper's Weekly, and is co-sponsored by Coles Library with funding from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History in association with the Library of America and the National Endowment for the Humanities. If you have not had an opportunity to go over to the Anderson Gallery to see that outstanding exhibit, I would just encourage you to do so. I was over there for the opening evening events, and it is really fabulous, and our Associate Professor Maura Lyons was responsible for really getting that together. So we will have a brief reception with some cookies afterwards. I also wanted to draw your attention to the current exhibit in the library's Collier Heritage Gallery, immediately to your left. The exhibit is entitled 1,000 Words, War and Anti-War in Editorial Cartoons. And this was curated by the library's Kathy Lincoln, who I think is here, and Bart Schmidt, who was a librarian on our staff. That material in this exhibit is drawn from the Coles Library Special Collections. Now, about our special collections. I'm pleased to announce that Drake and Coles Library have a new archives center. You may have seen it on the way in. We did an extensive modification to the facility and a construction project this summer, and the result is a new state-of-the-art center for the University Archives, the Library Special Collections, and the Harkin Ray Political Archives. There's going to be a formal dedication of the new archives on December the 6th, right, Claudia? Okay, in the afternoon. Now, I was serious about me walking the fields of Gettysburg as a young person. I grew up in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, and I did spend countless hours roaming that battlefield, either in conjunction with my buddies who used to ride our bicycles down and camp out. That was a different era, overnight, and then spend time on the battlefield, and countless hours with my dad and my family. So I grew up with an intimacy with the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously. So I'm always pleased and continue to be amazed at all of the aspects of the Civil War that come to the fore. So I'm very pleased that we're having this lecture this evening about yet another approach to looking at that critical period in American history. So with that, I want to introduce Maura Lyons. She is Associate Professor of Art, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I want to thank Coles Library for partnering with the Anderson Gallery in presenting this program tonight, and just briefly also thank a couple other funding sources, Humanities Iowa and the State Historical Society Incorporated, and it would help us greatly with future grants if you would add your name to the sign-up sheet that will be circulating shortly and fill out the evaluation form that you received as you came in. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Richard Samuel West. We're really fortunate to have Mr. West, the leading authority on the history of American comic art, on campus tonight. He's published extensively on 19th century cartoons and illustrated publications. His most recent book is Iconoclast in Ink, The Political Cartoons of J.N. Ding Darling. And as many of you know, Ding Darling, a longtime cartoonist for the Des Moines Register, Pulitzer Prize winner. And this publication is really the first to focus on the politics of Ding Darling's cartoons, so it's a great addition to the literature. Mr. West is also a dealer in out-of-print publications, and his business, which is named Periodicy, which I think is a great name, is based in Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming Richard Samuel West.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Professor Lyons. Please allow me to begin with two digressions. First, is there anyone here who knows what they were doing on April 12th, 2011, a little more than 2.5 years ago? Good. I thought it might have been someone's birthday or something. Mess up the presentation. It doesn't surprise me. However, if I had put that question to a Des Moines audience 150 years ago tonight, everyone would have raised their hands. Because on April 12th, 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, marking the start of the Civil War. By this time, 150 years ago tonight, the people of Des Moines were war-weary. Hundreds of thousands of Americans had already died. And the war was not over yet, not by a long shot. No one in Des Moines had any idea when it would be over. Everyone assumed that it would last at least for several, perhaps many more years. These facts are important to keep in mind when we look at these cartoons. No one knew what was to happen. No one knew with certainty that Lincoln and Grant would lead the Union Army to victory. The country was racked by debate over how to proceed. These cartoons reflect that debate. So when I look at these images, I try to suspend judgment. I try not to say, what idiots? Couldn't they see that Lincoln was great? Couldn't they see that the Confederacy was doomed? What, were they blind? No, they were just living in the daily ebb and flow of terrible events. The truth was that all of the people of Des Moines 150 years ago tonight were to varying degrees angry or sad, and all of them were afraid for the future. Second, we will encounter patently racist language and images in tonight's cartoons. To this issue, I do not believe we should whitewash our history. If we celebrate the good and the noble, as we most certainly do, we would be lying to ourselves if we did not also examine the base and the horrible. So please join me tonight in the spirit of a historical exploration. We can condemn those in the past for their racism, but we should be careful that we do not condemn them so much that it blinds us from owning a little part of that legacy today. Now, a bit of background on 19th century publishing. The cartoons we will be looking at came before the public in two ways, either as separately published prints or woodcuts in American magazines. The separately published lithographic cartoon print made its first appearance in the U.S. in the 1820s with the establishment of lithographic printing firms in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. There were, of course, American political cartoons that preceded the advent of lithography, like this one, but they were copperplate engravings, expensive and time-consuming to produce, which made their appearance few and far between. Also, for the most part, while some of them imparted interesting political opinions, almost all were poorly drawn, as I considered this one. This changed with the advent of lithography. This new method of printing cut the costs and the time of production to such an extent that the lithographic cartoon print suddenly became a viable business opportunity. And the artistic freedom it afforded prompted several talented draftsmen to take up the art. This is a pro-Andrew Jackson cartoon when he took on the United States Bank. For at least the first half of its 50-year life on the American scene, lithography was the dominant form of visual political satire in the U.S. It has been estimated that somewhere around 800 to 900 such prints were produced during their heyday from the 1820s to the 1870s. During the Civil War period, there were close to 200 cartoons published, with about half coming from the firm of Currier and Ives, and the rest from dozens of different publishers based in New York City and elsewhere. Unlike the lithographic firms of the 30s and 40s, who were all owned by Whigs and almost never published anything critical of their party of choice, Currier and Ives was an equal opportunity offender. They published cartoons praising Democrats, cartoons praising Republicans, cartoons criticizing Democrats, and cartoons criticizing Republicans. We will see examples of all of these tonight. The prints were sold in a variety of ways. Some were hawked by newsboys on city streets. Some were sold in bulk to campaign headquarters destined for free distribution. And some were sold through retail outlets. The general belief is that most of these prints retailed for 25 cents each, but we don't know for sure. The reception of the prints undoubtedly influenced their print runs, but most of these cartoons, I believe, were printed in the hundreds, not the thousands. As for the history of American humor or satire magazines, they stretch back to the 18th century, when political satire was a dominant strain of mainstream journalism. The most famous early political satire magazine was Salmagundi, edited by Washington Irving and James Paulding in 1807-08. But none of these early periodicals was illustrated. The 1830s saw a proliferation of comic magazines and newspapers, but the comic cuts they used to illustrate their contents were usually borrowed from other sources. The cuts then were used primarily to break up columns of type and were not central to the humor. This changed in the 1840s. In London, Punch was launched in 1841, and its success as a comic weekly, in which the artwork played an important, sometimes primary role in the humor, caught the attention of the English-speaking world. The first American attempt at a comic weekly came just a year later, in 1842. The Pictorial Wag, as it was called, was published by Robert Elton, perhaps America's leading publisher in comic almanacs at the time. But the Wag was not, as might have been expected, a collection of old cuts passed off as fresh material. It was a formidable effort with a full-page political cartoon and distinguished editorial content. But it only lasted, we think, 13 weeks. There's no complete run of the magazine anywhere. At the advent of the Civil War, American newsstands were crowded with comic periodicals. One class of magazine was the Quarto Monthly, about the size of Time magazine, of which there were two, Yankee Notions and Knickknacks. Both resembled oversized almanacs, full of comic cuts, tall tales, and pun-filled one-liners. Because they were monthlies, they did not attempt to be particularly timely. That is to say, they did not ignore current events, but neither did they feel obligated to recognize important news. On the other hand, the folio monthlies that more closely resembled Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's newspaper did attempt to comment on the news, even if they risked being out of date. The three folio monthlies at the advent of the war, in order of importance, were Frank Leslie's Budget of Fun, the Comic Monthly, and Funny Fellow, all founded in 1859. There was but one comic weekly being published in America at the beginning of the Civil War. That was Vanity Fair, not to be confused with any of the ones that have come after it, British or American. It was a smart and handsome product that highlighted the comic work of H.L. Stevens and drew on the wits of Pabst's beer cellar for its content. It should also be mentioned that the three news weeklies, Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, and the New York Illustrated News, published political cartoons on their back pages throughout the war, and occasionally printed a full or double-page cartoon within. The show at the Anderson Gallery highlights the back page cartoons in Harper's Weekly. Also, the two British humor magazines, Punch and Fun, should not be neglected, if only because Punch, at least, probably had a larger circulation in the U.S. than any of the homegrown comic periodicals, especially in the South. And finally, we should note that the Confederacy had its own news weekly, the Southern Illustrated News, and its own humor magazine, the Southern Punch. Both started in 1862. They were not well illustrated, given the scarcity of talented artists and engravers available for such work in the South during wartime, but both did print political cartoons on occasion. So, unlike the separately published prints market, which was dominated by Currier and Ives, the periodical field was highly fractured. At the outset of the war, then, there were 6 New York humor magazines, 3 New York news weeklies, 2 London-based humor magazines, and in the following year, 2 Southern weeklies, all of which featured political cartoons and circulated to the American reading public. While Vanity Fair would fail during the war, the rest persevered throughout the war and were joined by 2 more humor magazines before the war was out. All of the northern periodicals were pro-union, but not all were pro-administration. The British and southern periodicals were, generally speaking, anti-Lincoln and pro-Confederacy. So much for the publishing landscape. Now we will look chronologically at select cartoons that exemplify various attitudes to Civil War events, so that in the end, I hope you will be left with an appreciation for the diversity of viewpoints and artistic talent that was on display during the Civil War. Can we turn down the lights? This is called Honest Abe, Taking Them on the Half Shell. This is a Currier and Ives cartoon that was pro-Lincoln. And it's kind of extraordinary as a political cartoon for the period because of the close-up nature of it. Most political cartoons resembled the popular entertainment of the day, that is a stage setting. And so having this large image of Lincoln in the center of the cartoon, it really stands out in the iconography of the Civil War. And this has Lincoln holding half-shell oysters, or oyster shells, I should say, with his 2 primary opponents during the election balanced in the shells. And Lincoln says, "These fellows have been planted so long in Washington that they are as fat as butter. I hardly know which to swallow first." Douglas, who is a moderate Democrat and is right here, reclines on a soft shell, and he says, "I'm a gone sucker." Breckinridge, who was the candidate for the South and an adamantly pro-slavery, is on a hard shell, and he exclaims, "Alas, that I ever should live to be swallowed by a rail splitter." So as to not make you think that Currier and Ives was solely in favor of Lincoln, here we've got a savage anti-Lincoln cartoon that they also produced. It's called An Heir to the Throne. The Republican Party was reputed to be, well, it was certainly anti-slavery. It was turned against them that they were more than that, pro-black man. This figure in the center was a well-known exhibit of the day at P.T. Barnum's museum, and the title of the exhibit was "What Is It?" And so Currier and Ives set up this cartoon where Horace Greeley, the famous radical editor of the New York Tribune, is saying, "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce to you this illustrious individual in whom you will find combined all the graces and virtues of black republicanism and whom we propose to run as our next candidate for the presidency." Lincoln over here says, "How fortunate that this intellectual and noble creature should have been discovered just at this time to prove to the world the superiority of the colored over the Anglo-Saxon race. He will be a worthy successor to carry out my policy, which I shall inaugurate." And the black man says, "What? Can they be?" So this is, pretty savage stuff, and that characterized the campaign of 1860. The next cartoon is one of my favorites because it sort of transcends the day, and it shows the transformation of Lincoln during the campaign process. And it says, "A phenomenon of portraiture, showing how the chances of success affects the features of a presidential candidate in the eyes of his friends. And here it is, his first looks, his first looks, hideous, cadaverous, repulsive. And then as his chances improve, so do his looks. Now he is tolerable. Being chosen, he grows quite handsome, even angelic. And I think it's funny how the electoral process anoints people in American politics, and people that you can conceive of as actually being presidential fodder initially, through this process of exposure, opinions change about them. So too with Lincoln. So Lincoln wins, and the South begins to secede long before he's inaugurated. And there was a great deal of hopefulness in the North that this was sort of some aberrant behavior that would soon pass away. And so a lot of the earliest cartoons have this kind of passive, hopeful quality to them. And here we have Miss Columbia as Bo Peep, and she says to Buchanan, the sitting president, "Sick 'em, Buck, sick 'em. I wish poor old Hickory was alive. He'd bring 'em back in no time," referring to Andrew Jackson, who stood against South Carolina in the nullification crisis of the early 1830s. These black sheep represent the southern states that have seceded, and this is an interesting element. These wolves represent European powers, and they are saying, if we can only get them separated from the flock, we can pick their bones at our leisure. So this was here's old Hickory dead. So this is, an interesting take that we just need to persuade them. We need to talk to them, and they will somehow come back into the Union. Yes, this old buck. Yeah, that's Buchanan running from the challenge, as he in fact did. But people were hopeful after Buchanan's ineffectual leadership during this crisis that a new day was coming. And this is a lovely cartoon showing the Buchanan the iceberg, our great iceberg melting away with the sun of Lincoln rising. There was an episode on Lincoln's path to Washington, where the Secret Service told him that there was a threat of assassination in Baltimore. And so a story got out that he donned a disguise in order to elude potential assassin. And this is a cartoon in Harper's Weekly. It's got a lovely caption, "Our new President of the United States from a fugitive sketch." And it shows Lincoln all bundled up, trying to elude notice. Now we have Lincoln in power, and still, this is March, we're at a standoff. Sumter doesn't happen until April. So this cartoon in Vanity Fair shows the challenge that Lincoln faces. Professor Lincoln in his great feat of balancing. Here we have the bird of peace, the dove of peace, and Sumter. And Lincoln's efforts to try to avoid war, but that became moot when the South fired on the fort. The Confederacy fired on the fort. And the outrage in the North was volcanic, and cartoons like this began to appear. The Southern Confederacy a fact, acknowledged by a mighty prince and faithful ally. This shows members of the Confederate government, including Jefferson Davis here, appealing to Satan. And Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy, holds forward a list, the fundamental principles of our government, it reads, including treason, rebellion, murder, robbery, incendiarism, and theft. And behind the group on horseback, that's Beauregard, who was the leader of the Southern troops at Fort Sumter, at Charleston. And Satan is saying, he greets the Confederates with the words, truly fit representatives of our realm. Over his head flies a banner with the palmetto of South Carolina, and a large snake curls around its staff. So, heated stuff, but it was also mixed with a lot of bravado in the North, and this cartoon reflects that. There was talk early on about the Confederacy marching on Washington, and this cartoon, which may have been the most reprinted cartoon during the Civil War because it went through, a number of artists appropriated it and reissued it. Currier and Ives did as well. This is not a Currier and Ives version of it. This is, my understanding is this is the first version of it. And it shows Jefferson Davis in the Stars and Bars, and it says, and the caption is, "Why don't you take it?" And this is General Winfield Scott, who was the reigning military leader in the North, and Washington, D.C. is a big chop there. And, you know, a little reminiscent of a more recent president who said, "Bring it on." This was, you know, the North was full of itself and believed that the war, once the activities began, the war would be over soon. England, initially, the English sentiment was pro-North, and this is not well documented and has not been really reflected on, in part because Punch drew very few cartoons about the controversy before their opinion changed. But this is called divorce e vinculo, and e vinculo is the Latin term for absolute divorce. And it's suggesting that there had to be a complete and total separation of the North and the South. And with the rough caption, Mrs. Carolina asserts her right to larrup her nigger. The Punch changed its opinion after the Trent Affair, which happened early in the war, where some Southern ambassadors from the Confederacy were traveling to London, and American Union forces commandeered the ship and took the ambassadors into custody. The British were outraged and considered this a violation of their prerogative to have diplomatic relations with anyone they wanted. Also, I think by that time, in '62, there was growing concern in British manufacturing circles that strangling, that harming the relationship that England had with the South and its cotton producers would have terrible effects on the British economy. So there really was a 360 in England, and from then on, Lincoln had to contend with the challenge of discouraging England from recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate government. Here's another cartoon expressing some of that bravado, and it's a little scatological too, which actually is quite rare in most cartoons of the period, unless they're in the lowest of the low publications. This was a Currier and Ives cartoon, and it shows Winfield Scott ready for Jefferson Davis to come out of his hole in Richmond, and he was going to catch him in his noose. Of course, it didn't happen that way. The general was removed soon after because he himself realized that he was too old to commandeer the army. And McClellan was put in his place. And in '62, we see this continued bravado to keep the spirits up in the North when the war was not going well for the North. This is called breaking that backbone. And the backbone is this sort of dog monster called rebellion. Jefferson Davis is here tending the dog. And then we've got Halleck, McClellan, Lincoln, and Stanton with their mallets, skill, strategy, the draft, and the Emancipation Proclamation, which was declared in September of '62 to go into effect in January of the new year. Again, this is an example of how the North tried to keep its spirits up even while many people felt that the war was being lost. Again, wishful thinking. Here's another Punch cartoon that shows this increasing alienation with the Lincoln administration. This is called The Latest from America, or the New York Eye Duster, to be taken every day. And they had Lincoln in the role. It would have been just as appropriate to put an Uncle Sam-like figure here, but Lincoln fit the bill in both cases. So he's here mainly representing the United States, and it's got victory, defeat, and the New York press being shuttled back and forth between them with bottles of Bragg and Bunkum and Bosch feeding the liquid. The English were getting tired of the political spin that the administration was giving out, and the New York press was complicit in, to make people think that the war was going well. This is an unusual Thomas Nast cartoon, which he drew for Funny Fellow, which was a lowbrow humor magazine that he contributed to anonymously for 10 years. And it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century, that it was revealed that he drew these cartoons because he never signed them. But the reason why this is unusual, aside from the freedom that Nast shows here, which he didn't show in his earlier work for Harper's Weekly, is that it's critical of the Lincoln administration, and the cartoon is called That's What's the Matter. The defeats are piling up. Bull Run #1, Bull Run #2, 7 days battle before Richmond, lives lost, who stopped the enlistment. Everyone's, in Nast's opinion, not doing their job. They're asleep at the wheel. We come to the question of the slaves. This is another cartoon from the American Vanity Fair. What will he do with them? Abraham Lincoln says, darn these here blackbirds. If nobody won't buy them, I'll have to open the cages and let them fly. Vanity Fair was pro-administration, but it was also a democratic journal. It tended toward support for the Democratic Party. So it had a very conflicted, it cheered Lincoln on, but its views of the war as a war on slavery were very conflicted, and we're going to see some ugly stuff from them when Lincoln steps out from the shadows and says exactly what they're suggesting he might have to do of freeing them. But before we do that, I wanted to show you a few Southern pieces. This work shows Lincoln at his desk writing up the Emancipation Proclamation. His foot is on the Constitution. This is, if you could see it, is a view of an uprising in a slave uprising in Santo Domingo, and here's John Brown with a halo over his head. This was done by a Baltimore dentist named Adalbert Volk, and he is sometimes held up as the South's answer to Thomas Nast. But when his work is put into perspective, we understand that that's highly inflated, because he worked in secret, and he did his, he printed the plates himself at night and distributed them to his friends. So it's unlikely that more than several dozen, maybe a couple score of people saw his cartoons during the Civil War. So it's in retrospect, after the war, when his work was reprinted widely, that the South as a whole finally got to see what he was doing. But during the war, the cartoons that he produced would have had little impact on the morale of the South, because practically no one saw them. Here's a really crude cartoon from the Southern Illustrated News, and it's called Maps and Faces, and it says King Abraham before and after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. So we see that he has taken off his mask and he reveals himself to be the devil. Couple interesting little points here. This is the unfinished Washington Monument, which was suspended. The construction was suspended during the Civil War and wasn't completed until many years later. And the suggestion of the cartoonist is that the work of realizing the American Republic is incomplete as well. I actually like the unbelievable crudeness of the drawing, because I think it adds to its impact. It's it's scary looking, even though the artist had difficulty with his rendering. We find this to be the case in almost all of the Southern cartoons. They just had very limited manpower. Reputedly, later in the war, they were even using shoe polish for ink. As many of you know, in the Mississippi Valley, they were peeling off wallpaper from homes in order to print newspapers, because the embargo that the Union Army had successfully, the sea embargo that the Union Army had successfully enforced, really prevented them from getting the materials that were essential for publication. Now here we're back to Vanity Fair again, and this is, after they said, they had this sort of philosophic cartoon of Lincoln saying, well, we're just going to have to let them go. Well, this is their response once he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's a pretty nasty piece of work called The New Place, and the black man is saying, this child on the move to a new situation. Wonder what sort of person new masses going to be. Obviously, there's no celebration here. There's no suggestion that this is the right and proper thing to do. Basically, it seems to me that H.L. Stevens here is saying not much is going to change for the black man, and nor should it. In '63, there's a growing movement in the North emboldened by, within the Democratic Party particularly, to question the whole war. Gone on too long, too many people were dying, we were still at essentially a stalemate. So the Copperheads, as they were called, came to the fore, and they were especially strong in the Ohio Valley West, including in Iowa, where people had lost faith in the Lincoln administration, and they were talking about suing for peace with the South, and wanted nothing to do with the Emancipation Proclamation, and they were willing to let slavery continue. So this is a heavily didactic cartoon. There's a lot going on here. but the important thing is we've got Lincoln running away from the Copperheads who are threatening him and even eating miniature black men here. And Lincoln is shredding the Constitution in his effort for emancipation. These slaves or freed slaves are running after him, saying basically, save us, save us. And Lincoln saying, go back to your masters. Don't think you are free because you are emancipated. This, I should say, the caption harkens back to the first cartoon we saw, The Great American What Is It? Chased by Copperheads. So now they've actually put Lincoln into the role of the sad, deformed character that we saw in the first cartoon. Another Southern cartoon. This is called Master Lincoln with a New Toy. And this is fighting Joe Hooker, who was another general that Lincoln called on to, lead the Union forces. And this is a curiosity that I haven't gotten a really good answer on. I have a couple theories. But a number of cartoons of Lincoln that appeared in the South have him beardless, and well into the war. And I talked with a Lincoln scholar about this, and we seem to agree that it was probably because there was such an embargo on trading with the North that they actually didn't know that Lincoln had grown a beard by the Civil War. I mean, by the time the Civil War came around. The other possibility is that they were concerned that many of their readers wouldn't recognize Lincoln with a beard. So the artists may have known that, but drew Lincoln in a pre-beard state so as to not confuse them. In '63, the war turns, especially in the Mississippi Valley. And this is called Uncle Sam Clearing the Tracks. Grant is successful on the Mississippi, taking one Confederate fort after another, so that we finally, the Union forces, I should say, finally have control of the Mississippi, and they split the Confederacy in two. And this is a nice dramatic cartoon of Uncle Sam on an ironclad going down the Mississippi. We have Jefferson Davis here say, "Oh, Johnny Bull, help me." And Johnny Bull now has doubts about supporting the Confederacy. And he says, "No, Jeff, you can't get into my boat now." And others, France, which had recently invaded Mexico, has got new respect for the Confederacy. And this represents Cuba. You know, brother, I always was your friend. And the Spanish authorities there. This cartoon was done by William Newman, whom I wrote a book on, and whose work I really enjoy. He was British, came over to the United States, and so he was very concerned during the war about how Europe was perceiving us, and he loved to do cartoons belittling John Bull and his predicament as a newfound loyal American. And here's another cartoon by him, which I think is really dramatic. It's called Final Issue of the War, The Longest Purse Wins. This was produced in early '64, and the war was really beginning to wear on the South. They didn't have the materiel, they didn't have the troops, they didn't have the money to keep up the fighting. So we've got a really lovely drawing of Lincoln with those long legs and a huge U.S. Treasury purse, and Jefferson Davis with his sad little sack of money. "Better give in, Jeff. You have not half a chance. Don't you see I've the longest purse?" says Lincoln. Now we come to the 64 presidential campaign. Lincoln has to run for office, and in the early days of that campaign, since he didn't win with the majority in 1860, the parties were fractured, there was no guarantee that he was going to win re-election, and even Lincoln himself doubted it. This is an early Currier and Ives anti-Lincoln cartoon called Running the Machine, which shows Fessenden, the new Treasury Secretary who had replaced Salmon Chase, running the Greenback Mill, just producing more and more money, flooding the market. And these are cabinet officers. Lincoln here is in the center, just laughing, saying, all this reminds me of a most capital joke. This is Gideon Wells, who's head of the, who was Secretary of Navy, and I love what they've given him to say. He says, they say the Tallahassee sails 24 miles an hour. Well then, we'll send 4 gunboats after her that can sail 6 miles an hour, and that will be just enough to catch her. So again, playing on that NAS cartoon of a year earlier of the incompetence of the administration. Luckily for Lincoln, he was up against the retired general of the Union Army, McClellan, who was nominated by the Democrats. And he was in a predicament because he talked about supporting the war effort, but the 1864 Democratic platform called for a sued peace with the South. So this shows him being two-faced, saying, I support the platform, I support the soldiers. And we have Satan here helping carry the Democratic platform. Here's Jeff Davis. Here's his running mate. And then this is Clement. This is one of the leading Copperheads of the day, Vallandigham of Ohio. And the devil says, well, Jeff, it's no use trying to hold up this rickety old platform. I guess I'll leave you to your own fate. And the Irishman with the club here, who represents the Democratic, the sort of the stalwart New York Democratic Party, says, all right, General, if you're in favor of resisting the draft, killing the niggers, and pace with the Southern peace, spelled pace with the Southerners, I'll knock any man on the head that'll vote against ye. So tying together a lot of images, you know, traitors, violent immigrant faction, and only the Union soldier here is repudiating them. He says, it's no use, General. You can't stand on that platform and come that blarney over me. I smell brimstone. Currier and Ives continue with now a pro-Lincoln cartoon. We saw the anti-Lincoln cartoon. We saw the anti-McClellan cartoon. Here's a pro-Lincoln cartoon. And this is an extraordinary one. I really like it. It shows McClellan offering a branch of peace to Jeff Davis, who is threatening the loyal black Union soldier. And it says, your plan and mine. So McClellan's plan is to offer peace to the South and not to care about what happens to the black man. Lincoln, backed up by a heroic black Union soldier, is shown taking the bayonet to Davis and subduing him. The reason why this is extraordinary is that most people in the North still weren't comfortable with the idea of fighting the war to free the slaves. The call to save the Union was a much more powerful clarion call. And so this cartoon posits the idea that we're continuing this war in order to respect the rights of the black man. It's a fairly rare cartoon for Civil War cartoons, and I assume that's because it didn't sell well, and Currier and Ives didn't print a lot of them. Now we've got a pro-McClellan cartoon, The True Issue or That's What's the Matter. So Courier Knives shows Lincoln and Jefferson Davis tearing apart the United States, and McClellan is stopping them both and saying the Union must be preserved at all hazards. So, depending on your political preference, you could choose any one of these cartoons and hang it in your home or put it behind the counter of your bar or your public place and express your sentiment. William Newman comes back in '64 with a series of wonderful cartoons that I'm sure lifted the spirits of the North. These were big, printed large. This says, "Symptoms of spring, Uncle Abram's crop begins to shoot." And it's a lovely play on words. We've got the Treasury in the back providing the sunshine that's necessary for the troops to be raised, and these plants are progressively sprouting up into soldiers who are shooting at Dixie, and Jefferson Davis is under the cloud of the challenges that the South was facing in '64. But I just like to imagine people who were despairing over the war, getting this weekly, or I should say monthly publication, and opening up to the center 2 pages, and just feeling better about things because of it. Now we come to Thomas Nast. People may be saying, why the heck haven't we seen more of Thomas Nast? Well, the fact of the matter is that Nast actually drew very few Civil War cartoons. And the ones that he did were of this nature. There are only about a dozen. The reason why he's reprinted in history books all over the place is, number one, because of the prominence of Harper's Weekly, the magazine he worked for, but also because of the fame he later attained, but also because they were probably seen by more people than just about any of the cartoons we've looked at so far. So even though they were few and far between, they had great impact. And this is a statement on the Democratic platform called Compromise with the South. And it says, dedicated to the Chicago Convention, referring to the Democratic Party convention of the previous month. And it's got Jefferson Davis triumphant, shaking hands with a wounded Union soldier, and with his foot on the grave of in memory of the Union heroes in a useless war. Very dramatic. It had a big impact on the election in the North. But there were still Northerners, even as '64 was turning in favor of the Union, and Sherman was beginning his march to the sea, that had become fed up with Lincoln. And here is one of them. It's called The National Joker, salary $25,000 per annum. And it shows Lincoln, again, using that phrase from the earlier cartoon we saw, "This reminds me of a little joke. This reminds me of another little story." Some people were upset with the fact that Lincoln resorted to humor and to anecdote while the Temple of Liberty burns, the soldiers in the hospital and the battlefield are giving their all. But the Republican press turned that around and issued this lovely little cartoon. "That reminds me of a little joke," and that's McClellan standing on his palm. So, of course, we know that Lincoln won, and this is the most succinct and lovely cartoon of the election. Long Abe Lincoln, a little longer, with the election returns. What makes this, of course, full of pathos is that it truly was just a little longer. But Punch was not reconciled. And they echoed the cartoon we saw earlier of the Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation in the Southern periodical. Here it is in for his second innings, showing him as a cricketer, taking off his mask and revealing himself as death incarnate. But as we know, Lincoln is assassinated in April, and the North is horrified, and it brings forth a flurry of cartoons on the subject. This is one of the most affecting because it's so grotesque. It says, "Satan tempting Booth to the murder of the president," and it shows Booth standing outside the Lincoln's seat at Ford's Theater, and Satan in this, like I said, grotesque form, whispering in his ear. I'm sorry? It was by a Philadelphia lithographer named McGee. Now we have the end of the war and the single event. We have almost no cartoons on Appomattox because they are eclipsed by the surrender of Jefferson Davis. And the story went that he was found in women's garb trying to escape. I believe it was much more complicated than that. He was, the way I understand the story is it was misting out. His wife handed him her shawl as he exited the tent where they were staying in Georgia. The Northern cartoonists, of course, had a heyday with this and turned him into being dressed completely in a woman's clothing of the day. And this is an interesting, sociologists are interested in this cartoon because it expresses the unmanliness of the situation, this coward donning women's clothes to escape his fate. It's also an interesting bookend to the cartoon we saw at the beginning of Lincoln coming into Washington in disguise. So we have the war beginning with a castigation of a disguise, and the war ending with dozens of cartoons, literally, making fun of Jefferson Davis for supposedly donning a disguise. So I wanted to end the evening on a little more celebratory note. This cartoon actually appeared in 1861, but I like it a great deal. It shows Lincoln being assaulted by all the Lilliputians seeking office. But here he is towering over the people. So thank you for listening tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Did soldiers in the field get any Harpers? How much did they get?
I think actually a good deal, because they were encouraged, Northerners were encouraged to forward things in the mail to their soldiers in the field, and it certainly depended on where they were stationed, what field of battle, what campaigns they were involved in. But I think a significant number of, especially in the beginning of the war and the middle period of the war where things were very slow, well, even the siege of Richmond, where the soldiers sat and sat and sat, waiting for action, that I think a lot of the Northern periodicals were circulated. It's interesting from publishing history that a number of the Northern periodicals who catered to the South, sporting journals and things like that, immediately went under with the beginning of the Civil War because they lost their readership and they couldn't mail to the South. So it had a kind of a revolutionary effect on American periodicals. Magazines that had been around for decades, for generations, went under immediately when they were cut off from their southern market.
Are there new cartoons being discovered at all, or is the field pretty much full of the samples and
That's a good question.
has everything been found?
I would say if you had asked that question 15 years ago, the vast majority of attention was on Harper's Weekly and on Courier and Ives prints. So a lot of these cartoons that you saw tonight were from more obscure periodicals. A book was published in 2002 called From Rail Splitter to Icon, where Gary Bunker assiduously went through these more obscure publications and reprinted them. So it was an award-winning book because it brought to light material that had been ignored for 150 years or more. There's always a chance, and there continues to be especially separately published prints that surface that no one has seen before, but it's increasingly rare. So I think you could, with a bit of scholarship, if you wanted to pull together a catalog raisonné of the Civil War cartoons, you could do a pretty good job right now. Well, thanks a lot for coming this evening. I appreciate it.
I wanted to let everybody know that we do have cookies and coffee and punch out in the foyer, and please come and look at the exhibits in the Collier Heritage Room. And if anybody would like a tour of the archives, I'd be more than happy to take them through. And that is way back, that's your GPS, it's way back in the northwest corner of the library. So
Thank
thank
you.
you again for coming.
Thank you to Claudia Fraser also for helping to organize this from the Coles Library. And again, for our speaker this evening, thank you.